endurance, right? So today we're going to be looking at two other components. We had a previous little Instagram live on this where we dialed into energy systems, right? We dialed into the aerobic and anaerobic energy system, the benefits of lactate, what it does at the local target tissue, what it does systemically throughout the body, and how really lactate is a pre-digested form of glucose, right? It's pyruvate that's just attached to hydrogen to help buffer it, which means that it's freely available energy, and the brain and the body likes that. So maybe there's some stuff down the pipeline, who knows, for things like concussion treatment, or more so working with traumatic brain injury. I could probably say Parkinson's disease, because there's really good evidence out there on brain energy metabolism and lactate, high intensity training. So, but for today's session, we're going to talk about endurance in relationship to ventilation and heart rate. Okay, so generally speaking, whenever we are applying BFR tourniquets, let's draw our little human being here. Okay, so I'm going to draw my little anime character guy. All right, so whenever we're dealing with, that's a big arm, jeesh. Somebody help me out here, man. I gotta remember my heads, how many heads somebody is. Okay. So whenever we're talking about blood flow restriction, we're talking about restriction. We're not talking about occlusion. So that means that if I apply a tourniquet, all right, and I'm using my little PTS, personal tourniquet system from Delphi, right? Spell it correctly. I ain't numbnuts. I'm a numbnuts, guys. You think now after a year. So I have my Delphi system hooked up to this guy. Right? I'm able to track him so that essentially I'm allowing his heart, right? I'm allowing his heart to continue to pump out, right? 20% blood flow in, right? That's because these tourniquets, right, are blocking, right, 80%. Okay, so 20% is going in because I'm blocking 80%. So that means I'm not actually occluding blood flow, right? Because when we say occlusion, we're talking about 100%. When we're talking about restriction, for BFR specifically, for the lower extremities, we're talking about 80%, what's known as limb occlusion pressure, right? 80% of that, right? So occlusion is basically the full limb occlusion pressure. So we're doing 80% of that. And for the upper extremities, it's generally 50% LOP, right? So these systems are monitoring this. But what they're doing is they're completely blocking out 100% venous return. That's because veins are superficial, right? So I'm blocking out 80% arterial flow in, so I'm only allowing 20, but I'm occluding completely 100% back. So let's kind of see what this does to the heart. Let me see where that camera is pointing. Okay, so if I look at heart rate, right? Heart rate typically with BFR we're going to see is going to slightly increase, right? So it's not a significant increase compared to high intensity training, but we are going to see that heart rate does increase, okay? And we're going to also see that aside from heart rate increasing, we're also going to see that things like, let's say for example, TPA. So TPA is a is a clot busting enzyme, right? So we'll just say an anti-clot enzyme factor. Ugh. I apologize for my spelling today, guys. Anti-clot, right? TPA rises. Okay? And this is important because what it shows us is that in high intensity training, and we compare it to BFR, the same two things will happen. Heart rate will go up and TPA will go up. But when we look at the heart rate in BFR, it's much lower than what happens with high intensity training. That's why when we see older people exercise with BFR, they don't really run a risk of going into a very high heart rate zone. Now, let's think about why heart rate goes up. Well, for one, if I reduce venous return, I'm going to essentially decrease something that's called stroke volume. Okay? Stroke volume meaning the amount of blood volume that my heart got out in a stroke. So stroke volume and heart rate are very tied into one another, such that if I take heart rate, right, times stroke volume, this actually equals something we call cardiac output. And cardiac output, hold on, I got a question here. Please post this on your YouTube later. I'm having a hard time viewing. I have a unit and would love to hear this. All right, cool, yeah, we'll do. I'm getting around to it, Waj143. It's just really difficult to actually get all these uploaded pretty quick, simply because my internet at home is slow. I'm gonna be resolving that this week. It's not like it's slow. I have like 25 megabytes per second, but apparently that's slow to upload these videos. I need more. So, in order to maintain cardiac output, it's just a simple math equation. If I have a drop in stroke volume, all right, I have to have a subsequent rise in heart rate in order to maintain balance, right? In order to maintain it quasi the same as it was before. So the neat thing is that the body's gonna essentially be releasing TPA while this is happening, which is really important because as that byproduct and as that plasma is being pushed into the muscle, that's what makes up cell swelling. That was on another topic we did. When that happens, that TPA is so critical to be pumping out because it's gonna help me to not have any of the negative effects that happens with stasis. Here's where we run into some issues in the clinical setting. If we apply BFR to individuals who have compromised circulatory systems, and we're not able to actually have a system that can adjust, meaning it's a static system, like a knee wrap or even a blood pressure cuff, if it's statically held, that venous pulling can increase basically increase stasis. And that TPA is really important in this case, because if I don't have a way to regulate pressure, meaning I start my session off at whatever that my 80% LOP is, which it can vary, okay? Remember, LOP, right, for how we look at it now, what seems to be the most correlated characteristics for LOP has a lot to do with limb circumference, which is largely based off of sex and race, with men needing more pressure than women, right? And whereas blacks need more pressure than whites or Latinos, but we also understand that the actual systolic blood pressure can play roles as well, especially when we're dealing with a compromised system. So this is where I always tell you, if you're in a clinic setting and you're applying BFR, you need to be doing it with a medical device because you are in a clinic setting. That means you have something that can actually monitor that person's percentage. Well, first diagnose that percentage of LOP, then track the LOP, and then have a system that can adjust in real time to the changes in pressure that are happening below the tourniquet. Because you want to have something that, if I start, let's say my LOP for my legs was, let's say set 1, my LOP was 100 and let's say 68 millimeters of mercury, right? Well, by the time I get to set 4, I want a system that's going to keep me at 168 millimeters of mercury the entire time. Mind you, my limb is getting bigger because of cell swelling, and I'm starting to have more stasis occur, and those pressures are going up, right? Let's say I get to 174 millimeters of mercury, right? Because mind you, tourniquets have what's known as a pressure gradient. Not just the pressure, but pressure gradient, where there's more pressure being applied in certain areas of the tourniquet, and especially if we're dealing with a straight tourniquet and not a contour tourniquet, these things can really up the pressure. Then that's very easy for me to say that 168 is 80% of my LOP and 174, man, that's getting close to my 100% occlusion, right? If I'm applying this to an older person, or if I'm applying this in a clinic setting, somebody who just had a surgery, who was recently on clot thinners or blood thinners, man, there's a lot of risk with it, and that's why I want to use a medical device.